welcome to this panel organized kindly by the Hrant Dink Foundation. Can you hear us, translators? Yeah? Okay, good. Okay, we'll make, okay. My name is Yaman Akdeniz. I'm a law professor at the Istanbul Bilgi University. I don't normally describe myself as a traditional academic. I call myself a pracademic because I do practice. I'm not a practicing lawyer, but together with my colleague Kerem Altıparmak from Ankara University, we are heavily involved with freedom of expression litigation in Turkey, whether it's internet related or whether it is post-coup attempt cases. We give assistance to the likes of Atilla Taş, Murat Aksoy, Tunca Öğreten, and Mahir Kanat, among others. And we're involved in the last 10 years or so with over 200 cases of political speech and censorship cases, prosecutions. We also provide assistance to academicians for peace, several of them, with regards to their ongoing prosecution. So today, this panel's purpose is to talk more about activism in relation to freedom of expression, and not just in Turkey. We're going to talk about, we have two colleagues from Article 19. Article 19 is a leading freedom of expression organization in the world, I would say, and they're very active in Central Asia. Joanna will talk about experiences there. Georgia will talk generally about Article 19's wide range of activities in relation to freedom of expression, but also her experience in relation to Turkey and what they have been doing in the last few years or so, monitoring and other support activities. So this is what we are going to be talking about. So I will first ask Georgia to make a presentation, and then we'll move to Joanna, and then we'll talk more about Turkey, and then ask you to contribute and try to answer your questions as well. So please, Georgia.
Thank you. So my name is Georgia Nash, and I coordinate Article 19's Turkey projects. But today I'm going to, as Yaman said, introduce Article 19 as a whole, just to say what we do overall, because many people haven't heard about us in detail, and then talk a little bit about what we do in Turkey without boring you on the things you already know about Turkey, and then introduce some of our policies around hate speech and equality and freedom of expression, which Joanna will talk more about, because that's related to the project that she's coordinating. So Article 19, we were founded in 1987, and our name, Article 19, comes from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's the article related to freedom of expression. We work all around the world. We have offices particularly in Mexico, the US, Brazil, East Africa, Senegal. We have a program focusing on Europe and Central Asia. That's the program that we work on. And we also have the Middle East and North Africa, Bangladesh and Southeast Asia. In addition to that, we have our law and policy team. We have communications and obviously our finance team. But the law and policy is kind of a very core function for Article 19. We have it's kind of, I'd say, the core of our work is that we develop legal policies around freedom of expression, trying to push for progressive interpretations of international law around freedom of expression. So they do that primarily through developing policies on the kind of intersection of freedom of expression with other rights, or when can you restrict freedom of expression, so looking at freedom of expression and national security, and those kinds of issues. Access to information, yeah. One of Yaman's favourite topics. He's done much work with us on that. So. And so they develop these policies and also sets of principles, and then we use them in international human rights bodies such as at the UN to and with governments to push for these progressive interpretations to ensure that we don't, they don't find ways to restrict expression more. We're pushing for broad, progressive understandings. So then, let me move to the next slide. We have, this is our staff location. We have a kind of a broad range of offices. We're not like, we're not as big as like an organisation like Amnesty or like Human Rights Watch. We don't have work in every country, but we kind of try. We've got like offices in several regions, and we have a fair spread. This is our strategy. So we developed Article 19. Spent in the last couple of years, basically went through a year-long strategy process where we developed like what do we want to do in the world. And it was a kind of a bottom-up approach, trying to kind of combat the kind of everything being led by the London office, the international office, and so that the regional offices and the programs were informing what we would work on as an organisation as a whole. So it was about understanding what's going on in the world, and what do we think is the priority, what do we need to work on in freedom of expression. And so it was like a year-long process of consultation within the organisation. And we ended up with these 5 areas of where we work. It's kind of broadly divided into the right to speak and the right to know. It covers development and transparency. This is the access to information that we were just discussing, and this is part of the right to freedom of expression because it's about the free exchange of knowledge, of information and ideas. Digital, which is a large area of our work, which looks at like online freedom of expression, security online, broad area of work there, like internet governance. Civic space also covers kind of equality and freedom of expression, the right to protest, participation of marginalized groups. Media is where we look at media regulation and self-regulation, how should an ownership of media organizations and how that all those issues affect freedom of expression. And protection is where we work on protection of human rights defenders or journalists or anyone who's under attack for expressing themselves. And there are different kind of approaches to that where we look at self-protection methods. How can media organizations better protect their staff? How can people protect themselves online or offline? How do you protect yourself when in protest? And then also kind of advocacy and international advocacy, what you can do to protect someone if they get arrested. I mean, there's only, as we can see in Turkey, a lot of our work would come under that category, but it's realistically quite limited what we can do in reality. We can expose and we raise attention on cases, and we try to do our best in that area. This is again more of our kind of internal strategy process, but this is like the idea is that we need strong laws and policies, we need accountability and transparency, and we need an active and empowered civil society, and these are the areas that we focus on in order to achieve our goals. And this is the levels that we work at. So we work from the local, national, regional, up to the international level. The idea is that the international standards that are developed, like at the UN or the Council of Europe, are informed by local voices, what's happening at the local level. And that, our aim is to try and close the gap because those standards are usually quite high, but what's the reality on the ground is completely different. So what we're trying to do is to make that a reality, and that's where the challenge is. So what am I doing in Turkey? So at the moment, since prior to the coup attempt, we had a project on the right to information, as Yaman mentioned, and we were doing trainings with journalists on using the access to information law in Turkey, and also trainings for municipalities. Yes. Yaman actually did that training. Yeah, and that was the reality back then, that we were able to do that. The context has changed quite a lot. Obviously, this is not relevant or possible now. So after the coup attempt, we significantly changed our work, and it was more following the arrests and the trials of journalists. So we've been monitoring trials of journalists, but now also academics, the Academics for Peace. We've started following those cases as well. We're doing trainings on, soon to be doing trainings on trial monitoring for ourselves, and also kind of a group of international organisations who do trial monitoring, but we're not necessarily like, it's not necessarily our expertise. We're not all lawyers. We're not from a trial monitoring organisation, we're from a free expression organisation, and we find ourselves attending all these trials. So we're looking to have training, hopefully from the OSCE potentially, on more specifically how to do that better. We submit expert opinions to the domestic courts. This is something that we just started doing in the last year or so, where in Turkey you can submit an opinion on behalf of the defense, and you kind of, what we do is we use our expertise on international law, and we assess the charges against international law. And so we've done this in a few cases. We did it for one of the Özgür Gündem campaign solidarity cases. We did it for the Ahmet and Mehmet Altan. We did it for Şahin Alpay, and we've got another one coming up on the documentary called Bakur, which is about PKK, and we've got one, and we'll hopefully also be doing one soon on the Academics for Peace cases. Those are submitted to the court, and it's a way of bringing international standards into the cases. Although we don't. With the current situation, we're not sure that the arguments are really listened to by the judge, but we think it's a way of demonstrating extra scrutiny on the cases. You know, in addition to kind of being there, we're showing that we've assessed the case in detail, and we can see that it makes no sense in most of the cases. It just doesn't even make any sense. So we are also following the cases at the European Court of Human Rights, and we've been submitting amicus briefs, which is a similar thing, but it's a third-party intervention where you can, as an organisation, you can submit this kind of a assessment of the points of law or an assessment of the context where the case took place. So a coalition of international organisations submitted amicus briefs on all of the cases of journalists that went to the European Court of Human Rights. We did it all together, and we felt it was important to submit on all of them as a coalition because they represent quite different political viewpoints, all of the journalists, but they're all free expression cases. So in order to kind of take a very strong human rights-based approach and working together as a coalition, we did it jointly on all of the cases. The other thing we do is we join or we organise delegations and issue reports, and then we use these for our international advocacy. So we take them to human rights bodies, the Council of Europe or the UN, and we try to inform international discussions around Turkey. We try to push other governments to speak out, but we try to keep Turkey on the agenda at the UN. It's quite often falling off the agenda, even despite the circumstances we're under. And we use that as well to try and change the discourse. Sometimes, for example, right after the coup attempt, there was a lot of, doubt around. Is Turkey doing what they're, is this allowed? They've got a state of emergency. They're really under threat. Are they going too far? Or, a lot of governments didn't really they weren't comfortable speaking out because they didn't feel they had enough information. And we held a delegation and a number of organisations together, and we went and visited media outlets and spoke to a lot of journalists and civil society. And then we issued a report demonstrating quite clearly that Turkey was going far beyond the requirements of the situation, and we used this to speak to governments and to speak to at international bodies, and I think we contributed to a change in the discourse. Others as well also contributed to that, but I think now there's no doubt. Nobody's now claiming that Turkey's not going beyond the requirements of the situation, but now we have new challenges. So, for example, the commission that was established to review state of emergency, like dismissals under the state of emergency, this is still really praised at the international level. Recently, I was at the Council of Europe, and this is like a favourite project, I would say, from the Council of Europe. So, I think that's probably an area that we want to look at next, is to look at how that functions and take that information to those types of bodies. We work with a coalition, as I mentioned, of a number of international organisations, and I'd say that it's one of the best, it's a really well-functioning coalition. Our work on other countries is usually quite separate, but on Turkey we work together quite well. We have frequent meetings, and we have we coordinate on policy, on ideas, we discuss obviously with our local partners and our contacts in Turkey to align our messages and ensure that we're kind of coming with the same message. And then we have other activities coming up where we're doing more advocacy and some potentially some online modules in the future on freedom of expression. So yeah, this is kind of a summary of what we're doing on Turkey. Then just to kind of segue into what Joanna's going to talk about, to introduce her project. This is our work on, kind of an introduction to our work on hate speech. So why does Article 19 work on hate speech? There's been a rise of hate speech laws around the world, and there are implications for freedom of expression, but also for equality. And equality is a principle of human rights. It applies to all human rights, including freedom of expression. It's cross-cutting. And we were interested in doing this, and obviously there's incitement to violence, and hatred is an area where freedom of expression can potentially be restricted legitimately. So we were looking at that kind of area, and we also wanted to move away from a kind of free speech versus equality approach and look at it from a holistic human rights approach. Like, how can we take into consideration freedom of expression, but also the importance of equality and ensuring freedom of expression for marginalized groups? These images were produced, this image was produced as part of a project I was working on in the Middle East, where we were developing a website that explains about our policy. And so we commissioned artists to make drawings of kind of hate speech related things. So I'm just including them here in the slides. The next, so yeah, our policy kind of developed through looking at incitement to violence. As you can see, we have some penguins here demonstrating incitement. It was a website that's developed kind of for youth in the Middle East, so we used kind of comic style illustrations to explain it. And basically our policy was developed through consultation, and we have several policies like the Camden Principles, which is about equality and freedom of expression, the Rabat Plan of Action, which is an international, it's not an Article 19 product, but we contributed to consultation, and it's about incitement to religious hatred and freedom of expression. And we also had a paper on incitement itself, which was worked. It was developed through consultation with LGBT groups, and including in Turkey, we consulted with Karl Skele, our colleagues in the law program did that. And then finally, it developed into a hate speech toolkit, which was published a couple of years ago, which explains everything about hate speech and freedom of expression. And it kind of looks at these main questions. How can we challenge hate speech, promote equality while protecting free expression? What is hate speech? There's a huge range of understandings of what it is, ranging from kind of microaggressions all the way to incitement to genocide. So how do we then develop policies on it when we don't have a clear kind of definition of what it is? So the toolkit does a lot for kind of breaking that down. What is hate speech, and what are the different types of hate speech? What unintended consequences could there be from overly restricting hate speech? And how do we assess when hate speech should be restricted by the government? And what do we do about speech that shouldn't be restricted, but it's still harmful? It's still not good speech. So, this is, for example, this is kind of another illustration from that website, which kind of demonstrates. It says, like, you're blind, why waste your money on travel you can't see anyway? And this is like, it's not the kind of hate speech that you would, that would necessarily reach the level that you would restrict. But it's still maybe something we want to challenge. And what other ways can we challenge it? Whether it's through counter speech or education or laws and policies protecting equality, and inclusion, policies that promote inclusion and participation. And then finally, one area that we've looked at a lot is hate speech against LGBT groups. And this is an area that also illustrates quite often when hate speech laws end up being used against those people that they're supposed to protect. And this is something we've seen in a lot of countries, but we've also seen it in Turkey. I mean, recently the bans against LGBT activities in Ankara, one of the justifications for those bans was that it was inciting hatred, presumably against themselves. So, quite often these laws are vague, and they're used, and they end up being twisted and used against the people they're originally supposed to protect. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Joanna Szymańska, and I'm also with Article 19 in Europe and Central Asia department. I focus on hate speech towards LGBT people, and I focus on Eastern Europe and Central Asia, but Eastern Europe mostly. So we've been working in Belarus, in Moldova, in Russia, in Ukraine, and in Kyrgyzstan, having a regional project on tackling hate speech towards LGBT people. The main idea of our work, of our programmatic work, is to put into practice the theory that we have in the toolkit that Georgia presented before me. To try to use it in activities and to bring that positive change. Basically, our aim is to increase availability of positive coverage on LGBT issues in these target countries by cooperating with journalists, with media outlets, by training journalists and trying to get to know each other, to have a conversation about hate speech and what it is at all, and why it is important to tackle it. We also do focus on greater cooperation of LGBT organizations with broader civil society in these countries, because it is unfortunately quite common that the so-called mainstream human rights organizations even are not keen to cooperate with LGBT organizations, or not keen to include the rights of LGBT people as human rights as well. So we've been focusing on bringing civil society together and to establish a dialogue, a discussion on why it is important to tackle hate speech together. I think that I will start with, I will briefly come back to the toolkit just to show what are our main provisions from it, and then I will say a bit about the regional context. So you will, maybe you are already aware of the situation in Eastern Europe, but I will just in a few words remind you, and I will tell you about the situation of LGBT people and the legislation, legal framework there that is often used against LGBT people. And at the end I will just give some examples of how LGBT organizations, how civil society answers to that challenge, and how this counter speech works, because our main principle is to tackle hate speech with more speech. So that's what we are trying to do. Like Georgia mentioned before, we are aware of the fact that the hate speech legislation, incitement to hatred provisions are often abused, and it is often even abused against and used against people that we are trying to protect. So we are trying to show that it is important to actually put more energy into developing and the positive measures so to have more space for counter speech. And just briefly, that's the typology of hate speech that that we are promoting. That we think that it's like the correct one that should be followed. It divides hate speech into three categories. It's the most severe cases of hate speech should be, they must be prohibited. It's direct and public incitement to genocide, and any advocacy of discriminatory hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. And that should be prohibited by the states. Then in the middle we have the hate speech that may be prohibited, and it can be expressions individually targeting an individual, a person, a victim. So it can include threats of violence, harassment, and assault. But there is a huge category that also it was mentioned before, the hate speech, which is lawful, which must be protected from restrictions, but it has to be challenged anyway, because it also raised concerns over intolerance in the society, and this is like in our work we are dealing a lot with this prejudice and these negative stereotypes, which are very they are spread about LGBT people, but this hate speech is not severe enough to be prohibited by law. And to be able to somehow to understand with what kind of hate speech we are dealing with in each case, we are promoting the so-called six-part test, which is just six points that we should take into consideration. It's obviously more for the court, for example, when they should decide if this discourse, if the speech was inciting hatred. But it is very important to focus and to look at the context of the expression, because I think context is crucial, because one and the same discourse, the same sentence can have different meaning in different contexts. In one context, it can incite to violence and hatred. In another context, it can be completely harmless. So it is important to look at the context. Then also to look at the speaker, the intent, content of the expression, extent and magnitude of the expression, and also likelihood of harm occurring, including its imminence. I don't have more time to discuss that now, but it is very well explained in our hate speech toolkit. So you will, maybe if you are interested, you can see it there. But our main thought is always that sanctions for hate speech should principally be contained within civil and administrative law, and criminal penalties should be imposed only as a last resort and in the most severe cases. We do focus on positive policy measures that should be introduced by the states. But unfortunately, in the region where I'm working, the states, they are not fulfilling their obligations, and but it should be recognizing and speaking out against intolerance. So it is crucial that politicians, that public figures, if they hear such a statement inciting violence, that they condemn it. We will have some examples later. I will show you examples of how it looks like in reality in the region. There should be public education and information campaigns. Also, it should be led by the states. Equality training for law enforcement, for teachers, for anyone who from administration of. They also should be attending such quality trainings, and obviously pluralism and equality in the media, which is also an issue in the region that I'm working with. So what can we do when the states are not really helping us to tackle hate speech? We, of course, we focus on strengthening civil society and to make sure that civil society is heard and visible and stands up against hate speech. That's why we focused on this, we developed this regional project, because we decided that it would be important to bring together LGBT organizations from various countries, because they have met each other previously and they have known each other previously, but they've never worked on such an issue jointly together. So we wanted that they could exchange their experience and to learn from each other on what can be done when it comes to hate speech. And when it comes to the regional context, we are dealing with countries which used to be part of the Soviet Union previously, and the context is, it differs from country to country, but there are things that are similar for the entire region. So mostly LGBT people, LGBT issues, the rights of LGBT people are seen and presented as a Western concept, as something which is being imposed by Western Europe. Most of the time it's presented like this, and which is against the traditional values. And the term of traditional values is it circulates everywhere when you have an issue, when you discuss LGBT issues. So something which is not in line with the traditional the values that are traditional and for the region, and that's the same in each of the countries. And just briefly, I will go and I will talk about countries specifically. Starting with Russia, which is obviously the biggest country in the region. You are probably, some of you might be aware that there is this so-called ban on homosexual propaganda that exists in Russia. It was introduced in 2013. And it was an amendment to the Code of Administrative Offences. And this law, it bans promotion, it's called exactly promotion of non-traditional sexual relationships among minors. Based on this law, it is possible to, we've already talked today about blocking websites and online content, so it is possible to block websites related to LGBT people, even a group website which was meant for supporting LGBT children, teenagers, because they were able to write a letter there and to express themselves and to get some psychological help. These letters, they have been published on the website and on social media on a special page. Even that was considered as something which is harmful for the minors, and such a website was also blocked. what is positive that each time when something like this happens, such a website reappears elsewhere, because internet doesn't have any borders, so it's easier. But nevertheless, such groups, such websites are target of this kind of laws that obviously undermine the right to freedom of expression of LGBT people. And even this picture that you see, it was also blacklisted in Russia, so you cannot disseminate it in Russia, because there is also like a special list with extremist materials. And this picture was also considered as this kind of material. So that's why I put it here. It was especially for this. And what's important when it comes to Russia, you probably heard this terrible news from Chechnya from last year, when it was when a journalist made an investigation and found out that there were massive detentions and tortures and even killings of gay men in Chechnya, which is a very traditional region in South Russia. And this terrible news, it was followed by expressions, by statements of officials that clearly incited further violence. And this is again what I mentioned, that the context is so important, because I will show you now a quote from a spokesperson for Ramzan Kadyrov, who is head of the Chechen Republic. And he said, "You cannot arrest or repress people who don't exist. If such people existed in Chechnya, law enforcement wouldn't have any problems with them, as their own relatives would have sent them to a place they would never return from." And it seems like if you don't know the context, there is hidden hate speech, but nothing really severe when you look at this at the first time. But given the context and the fact that in Chechnya there are this old tradition of so-called honor killings, where families can really kill you for if you dishonor the family. Obviously, such a statement was an incitement to further violence against gay men. And this is, I think that from last year, that was the most terrible situation about LGBT people in the region that we all dealt with. Also, I will say a few words about the context in Moldova, where there is a very vibrant civil society, and where LGBT people really try to they try to do a lot to counter hate speech, and they put a lot of effort for strategic litigation. But this is also a country where, according to some surveys, 98% of people wouldn't accept an LGBT person. So it's with a very high level of intolerance. And this is unfortunately, also you can hear that also from the highest level of the authorities of the government, because last year, before the Equality March, which was organized in the capital, in Chisinau, the president said that he generally said that he was against the march, and he said that I promise to be the president for all, but not for the gays. And what was also interesting was the public discourse around the presidential campaign, which was before that, because he got elected, so he said it already as a president, but before, in 2016, there was a presidential campaign, which was full of homophobic statement, because there were two main candidates. So there was this Igor Dodon, who became the president in the end, and Maya Sandu, who positioned herself as more liberal, but she didn't say anything out loud that she was for LGBT rights. But one of LGBT activists, well known in the country, posted on Facebook a message to the community that I think that LGBT community should support her because that's our only chance. And it was her personal opinion, which obviously was said publicly, but it resulted in really strong hateful statements and homophobic statements towards this candidate. So even the representatives of the Orthodox Church, which is very, very strong and powerful in Moldova, they were openly saying that no, people, you shouldn't vote for her because she's a lesbian, she doesn't have a husband, she's 40 and she doesn't have a husband. How could you get such a president? She shouldn't be our president. So that was the discourse you could hear from religious leaders in the country. But what was positive, and that's the example of this vibrant civil society and joint answers to hate speech that we are trying to advocate for in each of the countries, was that the answer to that was really strong. So lots of journalists condemned it, lots of media outlets wrote about it, that all this discourse around this presidential campaign is homophobic and xenophobic, and also broader civil society supported LGBT community and made joint statements. So as a result, there was something positive to say about this particular situation. But Moldova generally is a bit, the context it's different than in Russia. It's more open. It's more there's more possibilities to speak out your mind, and there is more space for counter speech. We are also working in Belarus, where the president, who's been the president for 22 years, he was approached by one of the European politicians who is openly gay, and he was criticized for the regime in Belarus, for the dictatorship in Belarus, and Lukashenko answered on this that it's better to be a dictator than gay, which was then also supported by many people, and even in case of a hate crime, the first hate crime, which when the court in Belarus said that this was hate crime based on based on the hatred biased on against sexual LGBT people based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So it was the first case like this 2 years ago, when the court said that it wasn't just hooliganism, but the person was beaten because he was gay. And the defendant during the hearing said that, well, I don't understand. After all, our president is also against gays. So it shows that what these people on the highest level say, it really has a huge impact on the society, and people follow this as an example. That's why it is so difficult to tackle this kind of political public discourse when there is no support from the states, when there is no condemnation of this kind of statements. Then people kind of feel that they are allowed to do the same, or even more. And I will just also briefly mention Kyrgyzstan, where basically LGBT issues are of a huge taboo. I think that in all the countries that we are working in this project, it's the most invisible topic in this country. And there was a case when there was a religious decree issued by the Kyrgyz Muslim Spiritual Directorate 3 years ago, which included a call to kill homosexuals. And what was positive about it was that it sparked a debate. And there was a reaction again of some opinion makers, of journalists. There was also reaction to that of civil society, and it led to the revision of this religious decree. And also they removed it from the website in the end. So that was the case that I just wanted to flag, because unfortunately I don't have more time to discuss it. So just to briefly say what our partner organizations together with us, what we've been doing to deal with this kind of examples that I've just showed. Mostly we focus on civil society initiatives, so it is very important for us to establish a dialogue with broader civil society. But we also supported our partners to organize public campaigns on hate speech towards LGBT people. In some of the countries it was for the first time, and it was a big deal for the community to make a campaign, a public campaign, social campaign on hate speech towards LGBT people. Also strategic litigation, I have no time to talk about it, but for example in Moldova, LGBT organizations are really, this organization is really active in strategic litigation, and they have some, even some successes in it. But something that we want to further explore, and what we know that is very important if we want to bring some, if we want to change something, is the role of independent media, especially self-regulatory bodies. Because what we established during our monitoring, we also conducted a monitoring of hate speech in all these countries, including monitoring of existing legal framework, but also what are the existing responses, mechanism to respond to hate speech. And in some of the countries, media self-regulatory bodies, in their ethical codes, actually they do have prohibition of discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. And some of them did issue decisions condemning unethical behavior of a journalist or article that was published or a TV show that was broadcasted that discriminated against LGBT people. But although that's already some great news and it's good that it's happening, unfortunately these self-regulatory bodies, they do not have any real power to do something about it, because they issue decisions, but the media outlets concerned, they usually don't really care. They don't pay attention to this, because there are no mechanism that no sanctions or whatever that could help to make it more serious, these decisions. So this is obviously something that we want to explore further and to work in this area, to think what we can do to make these self-regulatory bodies stronger, so that you could really complain and to have a decision that would actually have an impact and would reduce the level of hate speech in the media. For example, of civil society initiatives, I have a picture from Moldova, which is, yes, it's from this year, March, which was organized, and around this there has been also a big campaign called Without Fear. As you can see, they don't have flags, rainbow flags. The idea was to this black square that they have on their T-shirts. It's a symbol of a fear that everyone has, fear from something that is unknown, or fear of looking outside the box or going outside the box. So that was the idea already, I guess 2 years in a row, which actually led to a much bigger number of participants of the Equality March. So actually it worked to bring more allies and more attention to the topic of equality, and especially LGBT, the rights of LGBT people in Moldova. Or in Belarus, this is something we didn't expect, given the highly restrictive environment on free expression in Belarus, but our partners managed to organize a national consultancy on hate speech, on countering hate speech, which brought together more than 30 representatives of civil society, also the main human rights organizations from the country, which a couple years back were reluctant to listen to LGBT community and to include also them to their agenda. And during these discussions we had that day, we managed to come to an agreement altogether to sign a resolution altogether, and that we will develop the anti-discrimination law, which doesn't exist in Belarus, including also LGBT community, because previously human rights organizations, they did develop the draft of the law, but they excluded sexual orientation and gender identity from it. And during that consultancy, they actually said out loud that won't happen again, and that they will include LGBT initiatives back to develop this draft law, which may sound perhaps as not a big deal, but for us, for Belarus, it was a big deal, because it was something that wasn't possible before. So this is the kind of small steps that we've been trying to make, and just to say that this project we've been leading on only for a year and a half, so it is really difficult to see some huge changes after this time, but there are already some positive steps, positive small changes that we see, that there is a potential to change something and to especially to develop the solidarity within a broader society. And this is I think something positive, although we are working in quite a difficult context and quite a difficult environment. Thank you.